Beneath the Colosseum floor, Rome built a machine designed to make death appear out of nowhere. Wooden cages climbing through stone shafts, trapdoors snapping open in a floor of timber and sand. Animals lifted out of total darkness, straight into the sunlight of the arena. Men below, turning capstans, pulling ropes, working in lamplit corridors no spectator ever saw. The audience saw magic. What they were really watching was machinery. The real Colosseum is not the broken ring of stone in every photograph. It is what lies beneath the floor that no longer exists. A second building, hidden underground. Built not for spectators, built for the show. For most of its modern life, this lower world was buried, flooded, forgotten. Today, it is exposed, and it changes everything you thought you knew about this place. Because the Colosseum was never just an arena, it was a machine. What survives today is the shell. The marble seating is gone, the wooden floor is gone, the sand, the crowds, the smoke from the lamps below, all gone. What remains is the skeleton. And the skeleton is not the secret, it is the clue. Stop looking at the walls, start looking at the floor that isn't there. Because what is missing is the entire surface that hid the real building. A complete underground level of corridors, shafts, cages, and lifts engineered to push animals, men, an entire stage sets up into daylight on cue. Once you see how it actually worked, the building stops being a ruin. It starts being a mechanism. Chapter 1. The floor that disappeared. The sand was not decoration, it was camouflage. Most visitors today look down into the Colosseum and see an open pit, a confusing maze of low stone walls at the center. That maze is the part nobody was supposed to see. In its working years, the arena had a floor, a wooden platform stretched across the entire oval covered in a thick layer of sand. That sand had a job. It absorbed blood. It gave footing. It hid the seams of what lay underneath. Because under that floor was a complete subterranean level, known today as the hypogeum. Two main parallel corridors, a grid of smaller passages crossing between them. Cells, storage rooms, ramps, shaft openings cut directly into the stone ceiling above. It was not improvised, it was engineered. When the building was new, this entire level was sealed in darkness, lit only by oil lamps, filled with movement that had to stay invisible from above. Animals waited here. Gladiators waited here. Stagehands worked here. Sets were assembled here, and the entire space was organized around one objective: surprise. The spectacle above only worked if the audience could not predict what was about to appear on the sand. That meant everything had to be hidden until the last possible second. And then, on cue, it had to rise. Chapter 2. The machine beneath the sand. Below the floor, the Colosseum had a backstage larger than many ancient theaters. This is where it stops being architecture and starts being engineering. Built into the hypogeum was a system of vertical lifts. Wooden cages raised on ropes guided through stone shafts cut directly into the masonry of the lower walls. At ground level, trapdoors opened in the wooden floor above. A counterweight system, worked by men turning capstans below, drove the platforms upward, through the shafts and out into the open air of the arena. The capstans were heavy wooden drums, each one turned by several men pushing against horizontal arms. The rotation wound rope around the drum. The rope, threaded over pulleys at the top of the shaft, pulled the cage upward. Archaeologists have identified the positions of multiple lift shafts across the underground level, distributed around the perimeter and the central axis so that surprises could appear anywhere on the sand. Reconstruction suggests that a single operating crew could lift a heavy load several meters in a controlled, repeatable movement in less than a minute. The slots cut into the stone walls of the hypogeum still show the grooves where the wooden guide rails once sat. You can still trace where the cages climbed. What appeared on the sand from the perspective of the crowd was simple. The floor opened. Something stepped out. It could be a lion or a bear, released directly into the open arena before it had time to register the change in light. It could be a trained team of fighters walking out onto the sand from a hatch nobody had been looking at. It could be a piece of scenery, a painted rock face, a small grove of trees, a wooden structure dressed to evoke a forest, a battlefield, or a foreign land. In the earliest documented games, ancient writers describe entire landscapes being assembled and then dismantled across a single afternoon. From the audience side, it looked like magic. From the underground side, it was labor. Coordinated, choreographed, timed. Crews working in low light below, sweating in the close air of the corridors. Animals held in cages along the walls, kept calm or kept hungry depending on what the next event required. Trainers managing the schedule of releases. Stagehands assembling the next set in a side passage while another set was still on the sand above. Cues passed through hand signals and shouted instructions. Capstans turning, ropes tensioning, cages climbing. Trap doors lifting at precise moments above. The timing mattered. A late cue meant a missed effect. An early cue meant the illusion of sudden appearance was broken. The Colosseum in its working years was closer to a working backstage than a passive monument. Closer to a vast piece of theatrical machinery than a stadium. And that machinery was not an accessory to the spectacle. It was the spectacle. But this machine was only possible because Rome first solved a much older problem, the ground itself. Chapter 3. The building that replaced a lake before Rome built the machine. It had to erase a lake. The water belonged to Nero. After the Great Fire of 64 AD destroyed much of central Rome, the emperor seized an enormous stretch of cleared land in the heart of the city and built his vast palace complex on it, the Domus Aurea, the Golden House. At its center, in the valley between three of Rome's hills, he created an artificial lake, private, ornamental, a reflection of imperial luxury, surrounded by gardens and pavilions in a part of the city where ordinary Romans had once lived. When Nero fell, that lake became a political problem. It stood as a permanent monument to what many Romans saw as imperial excess. Public ground turned into one man's private garden. The new emperor, Vespasian, came to power after a violent year of civil war. He needed legitimacy. He needed to look like the opposite of Nero, and the lake gave him a way to make that visible. He drained it, and on top of it, he began building the largest amphitheater Rome had ever attempted. A gift of public spectacle handed back to the people on the same ground a single emperor had once kept for himself. The message was not subtle. Where Nero had built a private pleasure ground, Vespasian built a public arena. Where one man had reflected himself in still water, 50,000 citizens would now gather to watch the empire perform itself. It was finished under his son, Titus, and inaugurated in 80 AD with 100 days of games. That decision was political, but the consequences were structural, because the site was, by Roman standards, a difficult one. Soft ground, former water, a low point in the city, surrounded by hills that drained into it. The lakebed had been chosen by Nero precisely because the valley collected water naturally. That same geography now had to support a stone ring rising more than 50 meters into the sky. weighing tens of thousands of tons. The builders had to go down before they could go up. Deep foundations were laid into the old lake bed. Modern surveys have identified a thick concrete platform sunk into the earth beneath the building, shaped roughly like a donut, designed to spread the load of the outer walls across ground that wanted to settle. The center of that platform, under what would become the arena floor, was left thinner, which is part of why the hypogeum could later be built into it. Drainage channels were cut to carry away the water that still wanted to gather here. Some of those channels still function today. None of this is visible from above, but all of it is the reason the building is still standing 2,000 years later. The same engineering culture that drained a lake to build a stadium then dug a second world beneath the floor of that stadium. The hypogeum did not appear in isolation. It was the logical next step of a project that from the start treated the ground itself as something to be reshaped. Which raises the most famous question about the arena. Could Rome fill the machine with water? Chapter 4. The question of the flooded arena. The most repeated Colosseum legend begins with water. The story goes that the arena, in its earliest years, could be flooded, filled to stage mock naval battles known as naumachii. Ancient writers describe such events being held in Rome to mark the inauguration of the building under Titus. Whether those battles took place inside the Colosseum itself, or in a separate flooded venue elsewhere in the city, is something specialists continue to debate. Some scholars argue the early Colosseum could indeed be sealed and filled, drawing on the nearby aqueducts and drainage system, and that this was possible only before the underground level was fully built out. Others argue that the mock sea battles described by Roman sources were staged at purpose-built water arenas in other parts of Rome. What is not in doubt is this. Water management was central to the site from the start. Drainage channels run beneath the structure. The hypogeum was equipped to handle moisture in a city whose engineers were used to thinking in terms of aqueducts, sewers, and controlled flow. Whether or not full ships ever sailed inside the Colosseum, the building was designed by people who treated water as a working material. Like everything else here, it was infrastructure pretending to be architecture. But what survived is only half the story. The rest was taken away and built into Rome itself. Chapter 5. The walls that tell a quieter story. The broken wall is not just damage, it is evidence. From a distance, the Colosseum looks asymmetrical. One side rises in 4 complete tiers. The other collapses into a jagged break. That break is not original. Earthquakes shook the structure repeatedly through the medieval period. A major quake in 1349 brought down the southern outer ring. Stone fell, and once it fell, it did not stay where it landed. For generations, the Colosseum was treated as a quarry. Travertine blocks were taken from the ruin and reused across the city. Palaces, churches, and parts of St. Peter's are said to draw on stone that had once stood here. Rome did not only inherit the Colosseum, it physically built later Rome out of it. What survives is, in part, a record of what could not be carried away. The harder structural cores, the buried foundations, the lower tiers anchored too deeply to dismantle. The bronze clamps that once held the travertine blocks together were pulled out of their slots during these centuries, leaving small square holes that are still visible across the surviving facade today. For a long stretch of history, parts of the interior were used for stables, workshops, and storage. Religious processions passed through the arena. A small chapel was installed inside the structure. The building stopped being an amphitheater and became, slowly, something else. A working part of the medieval city, built into a Roman shell. Chapter 6. The way Romans actually used it. The machine below the sand was only half the system. The other half moved people. The Colosseum could seat tens of thousands of spectators, with modern estimates generally placing capacity between roughly 50 and 80,000. That crowd had to be sorted, channeled, and seated quickly, safely, predictably. The outer wall carried numbered arches around its full perimeter, 80 in total at ground level. Each spectator's clay or bone ticket pointed to a specific arch, a specific stairway, a specific sector. You did not wander into your seat. You were routed to it. From the entrance arches, the audience moved into vaulted passages called vomitoria, corridors angled so that, at the right moment, the crowd seemed to pour out into the seating bowl as if the building itself was releasing them. That word, vomitorium, is exactly what it sounds like. A passage built to disgorge a crowd. The system worked in both directions. Tens of thousands of people could be seated within minutes of the gates opening. At the end of the day, the same network of stairs and corridors could empty the building almost as fast. Once inside, the audience was divided by class. Senators sat closest to the action, on the lowest tier, sometimes on marble seats reserved by name. Above them sat the equestrian order, the wealthy class below the Senate. Above them, ordinary Roman citizens. Above them, in the highest tier, were the seats given to women, the poor, and those at the bottom of the social hierarchy, often standing room only under a wooden gallery. A massive retractable awning, known as the velarium, could be deployed above the seating to provide shade. Ancient sources describe sailors from the imperial fleet at Misenum being assigned to handle it, rigging it like the sail of a ship. Even the sun, when it could be managed, was managed. The architecture itself enforced the social order. You did not just attend the games, you attended them from your assigned place in Roman society. What happened on the sand was just as engineered. A day at the Colosseum followed a structured rhythm. Mornings were typically given to animal hunts, venisione, staged on the arena floor. Species transported from far parts of the empire appeared in front of the crowd. Lions, bears, leopards, sometimes elephants, sometimes animals most Romans had never seen. Many were killed. Many killed in turn. Midday was often reserved for public executions, sometimes staged with theatrical framing. Condemned prisoners forced into reenactments of myths or historical scenes that ended in their deaths. These were the least popular moments of the day. Some Romans left the building for lunch. The afternoon brought the main matches. Gladiator combats, the events the crowd had really come for. Pairs were carefully chosen. Some fighters were celebrities with their own followings, their own betting markets, their own merchandising in the form of painted images sold around the city. Combat was governed by rules. A defeated gladiator could raise a finger to ask for mercy. The decision often passed through the crowd, then to the emperor or the magistrate sponsoring the games. Death was common, but not automatic. Behind all of this, the hypogeum kept feeding the floor. Sets, animals, reinforcements, the next surprise. The day above and the work below ran on the same timetable. It is important to be honest about what that entertainment was. Many of the events staged here ended in death, of animals captured and shipped at enormous cost, of condemned prisoners, of trained fighters whose lives were measured against the appetite of a crowd. The building was not only an architectural marvel, it was a public theater of violence, embedded in a political system that used spectacle as a tool of legitimacy. Emperors and magistrates sponsored the games to buy popularity. The crowd watching was also being watched. By the emperor in his box, by senators, by the architecture itself, which gathered the city into one visible body and held it there. Recognizing that does not diminish the engineering. It places it. The same Roman state that could move water across a continent and pour concrete that still stands after 20 centuries also built a venue whose purpose was, in large part, to put suffering on display. The Colosseum holds both truths at once, a triumph of construction, and a record of what that construction was used for. Chapter 7. What the night reveals. In daylight, the Colosseum flattens. At night, the building gives up more of itself. Floodlights pick out the surviving arches, leaving the rest in shadow. The vertical lines of the outer wall become more legible. The broken edge of the southern side reads more clearly against the sky. The hypogeum below catches just enough light to suggest its depth without revealing all of it. Shadow does here what sunlight cannot. It separates surface from structure. It lets the underground hint at itself instead of disappearing into a flat pit. The monument looks closer to what it actually was. A silent machine, powered down, waiting in the dark. Chapter 8. The Colosseum Today. What ancient spectators were never meant to see is exactly what today's ruin reveals. For most of the monument's modern life, the underground level was buried under accumulated earth, debris, and later structures. The hypogeum disappeared from view almost completely. Visitors in the 18th and 19th centuries walked across what they assumed was a natural floor of the ruin, unaware that an entire engineered level lay just beneath their feet. Systematic excavation began in the 19th century and continued in successive campaigns across the 20th, slowly emerging the corridors back into daylight. Each campaign revealed more of the working system: the slots for guide rails, the bases of the capstans, the channels that carried water and waste, the cells where animals had been held. In recent years, parts of the underground have been opened to controlled visits, allowing the public, in limited numbers, to walk through the corridors that were once sealed off from the public eye entirely. A reconstructed section of the arena floor has been installed at one end of the oval, giving a partial sense of how the original surface would have read from above. Stand on it, and the geometry of the building suddenly makes more sense. Look down off the edge of it, and the depth of the hypogeum becomes legible in a way it never is from the upper tiers. The monument is also under constant pressure. Air pollution from the surrounding city has darkened parts of the travertine over the decades. Vibration from nearby traffic and the underground metro line passing close to the structure has been a long-standing concern for conservators. Major restoration projects in recent years have cleaned the outer facade, stabilized cracked sections, and replaced corroded metal elements with materials better suited to the long term. It is, by some measures, one of the most visited monuments on Earth, drawing several million visitors a year. That volume itself is part of what has to be managed. Wear on the stone, erosion of surfaces, the simple weight of crowds moving through spaces that were not designed for modern tourism. The machine is no longer hidden. It is the main exhibit. A monument whose missing floor turned out to be the most important thing about it. The Colosseum does not really begin with what is visible. It begins underground, with foundations sunk into a drained lake, with a hidden level of corridors, cages, and lift shafts that turned an oval of stone into a working machine, with drainage and water management built by engineers who did not separate beauty from infrastructure. with centuries of damage and reuse written into every break in the outer wall. With a long, uncomfortable record of what the building was actually used for, alongside the genius of how it was built. What is hidden inside the Colosseum is not a single secret. It is the rest of the story, the part that does not fit on a postcard. The part that explains how Rome, at the height of its power, did not only build monuments, it built mechanisms, capable of moving thousands of people, animals, and stage sets in the service of a single afternoon's performance. The building above the floor is what survived. The building below it is what made it work. The Colosseum was not only Rome's giant ruin, it was Rome's machine for turning architecture into spectacle. And this is what Rome's giant was really hiding.